Unmuted will feature a variety of guests, including politicians, community leaders, entertainers, decision makers, and others, addressing news, breaking issues, and compelling concerns to the community and nation. If you would like to contact us, please send an email to unmuted@myyahoo.com. That's MYYAHOO.com. Today's guest is Eloris Speight with the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Policy Center. Welcome to Unmuted.
Thank you.
We are so pleased that you are here, and we've got lots of information that we want to share about those who eat what farmers provide and those who may want to be farmers, those who are farmers. We are going to talk all things policy. And as I was preparing for this, it became even more apparent to me that our local policies that are farm related are driven by the federal government, not really by state government, but by federal government. So tell me a little bit about you, then tell us a little bit about the Policy Center. And I'll always refer to it as the Policy Center for Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers.
Great, thank you. So I am the executive director of the Policy Center. I'm going on 7 years now. The Policy Center was actually authorized in the 2014 Farm Bill, and the Farm Bill specified that it was to be located at an 1890 university. Alcorn State University was the successful grantee, and as they say, the rest is history. So the Policy Center has been operational at Alcorn State University since 2015. We had our grand ribbon cutting ceremony in September of 2016. Now why me? So I actually retired from USDA as a senior executive service member with the United States Department of Agricultural Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. I actually, prior to NRCS, I spent a number of years working for Fannie Mae, so I spent most of my professional career in Washington, D.C. Now, agriculture, I grew up, or I was spent my summers, I should say, on my grandparents' farm. It's a 200-acre farm, family farm in Greenville, North Carolina. Tobacco farm back in the day, now soybeans and sweet potatoes. And so that's really where I got my exposure to agriculture, if you will. So taking the years in Washington, D.C., working for USDA and the agriculture made me a good fit for the executive director of the Policy Center. I mentioned that the Policy Center was authorized in the 2014 Farm Bill. The reason that the Policy Center was created twofold. One was to be a voice for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, and second, and if not even more important, was to ensure that there was data-driven information that was available for Congress in making agricultural policy decisions.
All right, so let's unpack a little bit of what you've said to us. You've got all of these years of experience with USDA. You spent most of your professional career in Washington, D.C., so you know how that system works to a large degree.
Correct.
You're right. What better person, and grew up on a 200-acre farm, or spent your summers there anyway, what better person to head up the Policy Center? And then you mentioned that Alcorn State University is its location, and you know, like it or not, we have to give a plug to the person responsible for it being at Alcorn State University. And my understanding is Congressman Benny Thompson was a driving force to have that located at Alcorn State at an 1890 institution.
Well, Congressman Thompson was very instrumental in getting then the Policy Center authorized in the 2014 Farm Bill. And as you say, so it really only makes sense that it be located in Mississippi The other really relevant point as well, that Mississippi has the second largest number of minority or black farmers there, out of all the states.
And you mentioned the phrase 1890 institution. I know that there are 1862 institutions. Tell us what the difference is.
Okay, and not very creative, but in 1862, the Moral Act then authorized 1862s, and they are your predominantly white land grant institutions. Because little brown and black children really were not admitted to your predominantly white institutions at that time. In 1890, the second Moral Act then was passed, and that created the 1890s, which are historically black college and universities land grant institutions. So that's the difference then.
All right. And in Mississippi, we have 1890 institution, Alcorn State University. Is that the only one?
It's the only 1890, and the only 1862 is Mississippi State.
Okay.
So most of the states that have land grant have two land grants, one 1862 and one 1890. One exception is Alabama, which has Tuskegee and Alabama A&M, so two 1890 universities.
Okay. And Auburn University is there 1862, I believe?
Yes.
Well, great. Well, tell us a little bit about some of the things that are going on in the Policy Center. You indicated that one of the purposes of it is to make sure that there is research providing data to Congress so that when they amend or change the farm bills, and they do that every 3-4 years.
5 years.
Every 5 years.
Yes.
When they make changes to that, there is some substantive information available to them to be able to make good decisions if they choose to.
That's correct. So let me start then by sharing the mission of the Policy Center.
Okay.
So our mission is to conduct research, analyze policy, and make recommendations seeking to achieve equitable and economic integration of USDA programs and policies for socially disadvantaged farmers. Now, I'm going to repeat. It is seeking to achieve equitable and economic integration. And I want to emphasize there's a difference between equitable and equal. If you start up here and I start down here, and you give us equal services, then things would never be equitable. And so our mission then is to create opportunities for the equitable and economic integration then of programs. The ultimate vision for the Policy Center is to be the premier authority for information on the history, content, current conditions, trends, and future projections of socially disadvantaged farmers, ranchers, and communities.
Now that is a broad goal. How do you get there?
Well, we have 4 priority areas then at the Policy Center. So stakeholder engagement, and stakeholder engagement is to ensure that there is broad engagement across the, especially the socially disadvantaged, but the land grant, the 1890 land grant community, active research, then policy development and strategic outreach. Now, and we call it strategic outreach because we don't compete for 2501 or outreach dollars with those organizations that provide direct technical assistance to farmers. We primarily educate on the Farm Bill and the policies that will impact then socially disadvantaged farmers.
Okay. So you said 2501. You keep throwing these terms at us, so we're going to have to define it. Talk about, first though, tell us who is considered a socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher,
Okay.
and who can be included in that group?
So the term socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers was first defined in the 1990 Farm Bill, and it was used by the Small Business Administration. And the primary difference at that time between minority farmers and socially disadvantaged was race-based, if you will. So it did not include white females. White females were included in minority farmers. And I say it depends, so that was 1990. Subsequent to that, there have been some definitions that have included white females in socially disadvantaged. Later, the 2501 program, which was specifically outreach for socially disadvantaged farmers. It also, the Farm Bill was changed to include veterans and new and beginning farmers in those definitions. Yes.
Is that still the case today?
Well, it is the case if you use underserved producers in USDA, because there are many minority farmers that take exception with the use of the term socially disadvantaged. And so USDA and others have started referring to them as underserved producers or communities. The problem with underserved, that term is that underserved communities account for roughly 80% of the farm population, right?
Really?
Yes. And so if you target 80%, guess who's going to get left out?
Those socially disadvantaged or minority or
black
of
farmers
color,
specifically.
of color.
Exactly.
Okay.
One of our research studies was conducted by Jackson State University, and they looked at then services that were provided to socially disadvantaged farmers between 2014 Farm Bill and the 2018 Farm Bill. And what they found is, okay, if you looked at the total, services absolutely did increase the socially disadvantaged farmers in total. When you pull back that onion and looked at each individual category, the category that received the most amount of services was white females. The group that received the least amount of services was black farmers.
Wow.
Yes.
So that meant that the program was not working as it was initially intended.
Absolutely. For those, historically underserved and race-based is the bottom line. So black farmers, and I'll say that because why focus on black farmers then? Black farmers is the only group declining in numbers. In 1920, there was nearly 1 million black farmers in the United States. Today, there are less than 40,000.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, so they represent 1.49% of the 2.8 million farmers and ranchers in the United States today.
Say that again for me. And
yes.
initially?
Initially, nearly 1 million black farmers in the United States.
And now we're down to 40,000.
We are less than 40,000.
Less than 40,000.
Roughly, and this was according to the 2017 census. So 1.49% of the 2.8 million farmers and ranchers in the United States. So without some intervention, black farmers will become extinct.
What does the research show is the reason for that? Is it systemic racism and providing financial support such as loans and grants, or issues dealing with credit? Because is the land going to? And I know I asked about 3 or 4 questions there, but didn't want to forget them.
So let's, like I said, look at one. So in one of the questions you asked, is it related to systemic racism? Absolutely. You know, that's one of the reasons that it started. That's not the only reason, but that is by and large one of the largest reasons. The other was the lack of access to credit. What we found recently, and this was according to USDA, only 8% of the 40,000 remaining black farmers then have USDA or FSA loans, direct loans. Yes, so that means that 92% receive their funding elsewhere. Yes. And so without access to credit, and I say this because as I have traveled the United States, then talking to minority or socially disadvantaged farmers, and I have talked to over 5,000 either in focus groups, one-on-one conversations, or we have conducted surveys, you know, in our research. And so it had been over 5,000. Access to credit comes up as one of their primary issues, either number one or number two, right?
Wow. And does your research show the reasons for the lack of access to credit? Is that one of those things that in the financial or banking industry, they simply don't consider the minorities to be a good credit risk?
That's one of the
and
reasons.
that ends up being systemic as well.
Absolutely. So that is, so they traditionally have lower credit scores, and so the decline rate is much higher. There is a lack of trust among the farmers there, so they're less likely to even apply in a lot of situations then, because they don't trust the government or the financial, you know, sources that are available.
And
Yes.
part of that lack of trust came about during the Jim Crow era years and up through probably in the 1970s, 80s even, because their land was being taken.
Yes.
They being the minority farmers' land was being taken when there really wasn't a legitimate reason for it to have been taken when you look at the circumstances of their white counterparts.
Yes, that absolutely, you're absolutely correct in that assertion. And one of the things that I'll share, because you've probably heard of the Justice for Black Farmer legislation that has not passed. It was just recently reintroduced by Senator Booker. But prior to that, and it was the efforts of 32 black groups that worked with the 4 candidates, Democratic candidates that were running for president, and that was then Vice President Biden, Senator Sanders, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and then Michael Bloomberg. So these groups met individually with their campaigns, and the campaign that came up with the most comprehensive then plan to, if you will, right some of the wrongs of the past was Senator Elizabeth Warren, and that was the Justice for Black Farmers. Now, Senator Booker later took the lead working with Senator Warren, Elizabeth Warren, and that's where the Justice for Black Farmers came into being. Now, as I mentioned, it hasn't passed, but there were certain items that was in the Justice for Black Farmers then that was transferred to the American Relief Fund Act, and that included debt relief.
Okay. ARPA funds.
Right,
Yeah.
the debt relief, which we can talk about that in a minute, but one of the things I also want to share then, that from 1868 to 1934, the federal government gave away 246 million acres of farmland in 160-acre land lots to over 1.5 million white farmers or families.
And how many black families got some land?
That was zero. I'm going to say it again, to over 1.5, because during that time, again, we're talking 1868 to 1934.
We're talking Jim Crow.
Exactly. So there was not. So those 160 acre lots went to, and they were grants, not loans, grants.
So they didn't have to pay a penny.
They didn't have to pay anything back. And so that's where, and then couple the next 100 years of systemic racism, then that whatever USDA practices benefited those same white farmers that were given this land.
Say that again.
Yes.
Say that
Yes.
again. Not again, but again.
Yes, and that's absolutely. So when you look at how we are, how black farmers are in the situation that they are in today, you can't do it without looking at history and what happened. So there were these, like you said, the 160 acre lots that were granted to white families, and was the source of a lot of the generational wealth then for white farmers. So we start there. So the Justice for Black Farmers Act was an attempt to close that gap. But what happened as that it went from Justice for Black Farmers to the farmers for farmers of color. And so you added in then your Hispanic, your Native Americans, and not to say, so one of the things that we focus on at the Policy Center is that, each of those minority groups have challenges and has a cultural history, but it is not a shared cultural history. Black then has a history of slavery and free labor. The Native American had prime land stolen from them. The Hispanics has a history, a cultural history as migrant workers. So each of those situations are different, so the remedies should be different from our perspective there. And what happened, you took the case for action for black farmers and justice for black farmers and said, okay, here's the business case. Let's remedy this for all farmers of color. And in fact, and then somebody added in white females. And so, it got to the point where the white male said, wait a minute, everybody's getting something but us. So it's discriminatory. Yes.
And have they filed a lawsuit? Probably. 13
different, white male organizations or individuals filed the lawsuits, and it was stopped in the courts then. Okay. That was the debt relief, American Relief Plan, the debt relief. There was $5 billion set aside for debt relief, or $4 billion debt relief, $1 billion for support. And so when that was, stopped in the courts, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed.
Hold that thought there, because we're going to take a break right now, and we're going to come back and we're going to start talking about that. But remind me to tell you about my experience with adding certain groups to the minority classification. You are tuned in to Unmuted. My guest today is Eloris Speight.
Welcome to the JMMF's Culinary Kitchen in partnership with Footprint Farms, the Farmers Hands Markets, and funded in part by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, sponsored by Humana. I am Chef Shishi, the owner of Just in Time, the featured chef of the JMMF Culinary Kitchen, where we prepare farm-to-fork centered, healthier, all-natural foods in the urban community. Our menu includes salads made from collards, kale, and spring mix varieties, fresh vegetarian soups, and fresh juice elixirs made daily. We're open Tuesday through Friday from 11 a.m. until 2 p.m. And remember, what you put in your body is just as important as what you put on your body. We look forward to seeing you soon.
Welcome back to Unmuted, and our guest today is Eloris Speight with the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Policy Center, located at Alcorn State University, but serving the nation. Tell us about the Inflation Act and how that has impacted the minority farmers.
Okay, so the Inflation Reduction Act was signed by President Biden on August 16, 2022. The highlights then that I think are particularly important, Section 1005, which was the debt relief that I mentioned, then of the American Rescue Plan Act, it was repealed. Right. And so, well, which was a good thing. And I'll say that because, as I mentioned, it was stalled in the courts, and it could have been there for years. So they repealed it, which made it a moot point there. And even if it had been implemented, there's only 8% of black farmers that would have received debt relief. So what Congress did then was take the money that was in 1005 and transfer it into the support, what was 1006. And there are two primarily beneficial. One was $3.1 billion to provide payments for distressed borrowers. And so with no regard to race or ethnicity, if you could demonstrate that you were a distressed borrower, you received release.
That's $3.1 billion.
$3.1 billion.
Okay.
$2.2 billion was set aside for discrimination financial assistance. So if you could provide evidence that you had been discriminated against, you were eligible to receive the funding, that part of that $2.2 billion.
So that's a total of $5 billion, or was the $2.2 billion part of the $3 billion?
No,
Okay.
that is a total of $5.3 billion.
Okay.
Then that is part of the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, and some of the $3.1 billion has already been paid out to distressed borrowers. Now, the $2.2 billion that is available for discrimination has not been released yet. Right now, last week, USDA announced their intent to locate a national administrator then for the $2.2 billion and 4 regional hubs then to review the claims, if you will. And so we're hopefully that's going to move us in the right direction. Our concern is that time has passed, and if something is not done expeditiously, once again, it will be the black farmers who are already waiting for their 40 acres and a mule that will be waiting for, additional broken promises.
Well, do you have numbers on how many farmers have applied for that $2.2 billion?
There has not been a process for them to apply yet.
Oh, so they can't even apply yet?
No, they can't apply yet. There is no process that has been defined. USDA held listening sessions, and 4, to my knowledge, 3 that were advertised and 1 for tribal or Native Americans. And they, took the input from those listening sessions to come up with a plan, which again was announced last week. But no, thus far, there is not a plan in place for dispensing of the $2.2 billion.
What kind of information would a farmer have to collect to show discrimination to be able to be eligible for any of these funds if it ever becomes functional?
Well, that's what it needs to be defined, right? And I sat in on 3 of the listening sessions that USDA held, and that was some of the concern of some of the minority farmers. They said, well, what if you went in the front door and was escorted out the side door? Where's your evidence? So I don't know, at this point, we don't know what will be required. Now, the Policy Center did provide recommendations to USDA, including, and again, they were just our recommendations. So proof through a farm number that you were a farmer, during this period, and evidence such as you were turned down, for a loan, or you received a higher interest rate than because it was the FSA loan was not accessible to you. So that's just a couple of examples of what could be evidence then of discrimination.
Wow. Well, and I was going to share with you about adding the white females in.
Okay.
I worked on the Farm Bill when the implementation in Mississippi when I first went to work with the Mississippi Senate. And during that process, it was so obvious on paper, it was almost like a slap in your face, because there were provisions in there that would have assisted and supported minority farmers. Well, those farmers who were male, who if they had a spouse, then the property just changed hands. So now the wife is a minority, even though before, yesterday, it was owned by the male who didn't fit into that category. Yes. I mean, and it was just so obvious, it was unbelievable. But it is things like that that has caused all of this loss of land and loss of farm numbers that you were talking about.
Absolutely.
In the minority community.
Absolutely. Those all contribute, and that is our concern, even with the use of the term underserved then. Because underserved includes not only socially disadvantaged, it includes veterans, it includes new and beginning farmers, and so really they might as well say it includes new and beginning white farmers, it includes white veterans, because the other veterans were already included then when in the minority categories. So when you added those additional terms and categories, it really is the white counterpart that is now included. And to your point, and then you have white females. So you have white females, white veterans, and white new and beginning farmers.
So the funds available to the actual minority farmers has been now significantly reduced by adding all of these other categories of people.
That is correct. Yes. Yes.
What can we do? What can, and you may be limited because I understand your role as policy and being non-biased to a certain degree in your recommendations, but what can the citizens do? Put pressure on their congressional delegations? I mean, what can be done from a realistic standpoint that can impact, number one, USDA to get off their behinds and put together the program, because we're having a presidential election next year. Is that what they're waiting for, hoping that the president's mansion will change hands? I mean, help me understand.
So a couple things that you said. So one thing, let's start with the Policy Center. So we have a list of recommendations that we have now sent to Congressional Black Caucus and we are in the process of sending it to the Senate and the House Agricultural Committee. Our recommendations then that will impact or benefit socially disadvantaged farmers. The other thing, so what the average citizen, if you will, can do is then, first of all, educate themselves. Make sure that they understand what the issues and challenges and even the recommendations that are being brought forth, and contact their congressional representatives and let them know where they stand, on the issues. Absolutely everyone, I encourage. To me, the most impactful is your vote, So absolutely, but to make yourself known is number one. The other thing, last week, black farmers. So my understanding, there were about 150 black farmers that marched in front of the White House, if you will. And it, what was achieved is the same day that they were marching, USDA did announce that they intended that, a plan for moving forward. And so they had been asking for it and had not received anything. So they were in response. I'm going to say in response. USDA did issue some guidance for moving forward. And so I think to keep the pressure on, but like I said, to make sure that they follow up with their congressional representatives and they find out the key issues and concerns is what I would say, yes.
Yeah, and when people are trying to have these meetings with their congressional delegations, they need to go with some facts. And
yes.
Can they get like a fact sheet regarding like the Inflation Reduction Bill and the monies that were put in there from the Policy Center, or where would the best place be for them to go to get a fact sheet or some factual information?
Yes, they can go to the website, Alcorn State University, and there is a link to, once you get on the website, a link to the Policy Center. And so we have information available there. They can send their contact information, and we'll send them direct information, copies of our recommendations. And we have a number of partners. That's the other thing that I will share. Harvard Law School, Vermont Law Centers. We're working with both of them.
I'm going to need you to hold that thought because we are
Okay.
coming up on another break, but
That's
we'll be
fine.
back.
Okay.
Welcome to the JMMF's Culinary Kitchen in partnership with Footprint Farms, the Farmers' Hands Markets, and funded in part by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, sponsored by Humana. I am Chef Shishi, the owner of Just in Time, the featured chef of the JMMF Culinary Kitchen, where we prepare farm-to-fork-centered, healthier, all-natural foods in the urban community. Our menu includes salads made from collards, kale, and spring mix varieties, fresh vegetarian soups, and fresh juice elixirs made daily. We're open Tuesday through Friday from 11 a.m. until 2 p.m. And remember, what you put in your body is just as important as what you put on your body. We look forward to seeing you soon.
Welcome back to Unmuted, and I'm joined today with Eloris Speight from the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Policy Center. Please restart that thought we had when we had to go to break.
So I was sharing the partnerships that we have developed at the Policy Center. So the Southern Risk Management Education Center at the University of Arkansas is one of our partners. the 1890 Universities Foundation, the Southern Rural Development Center at Mississippi State University, law centers, both the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic, Vermont Law School Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, Southern University Law Center. We work with the Mississippi Center for Justice, related specifically to heirs property, Jackson State University, the Tenney Group, the Mississippi Minority Farmers Alliance, and Tougaloo College, John Deere and Corteva Agriscience, International Produce Association, Walmart, their Center for Racial Equity, and then even within USDA, we have established partnerships with the Office of Partnerships and Public Engagements, with NRCS, with NIFA, and with the Forest Service Agency. So we have cooperative agreements with those. And I share that list of partners to say they can contact any one of those partners as well as the Policy Center, and will be informed on recommendations or what they can do. So there are a number of ways to get involved, you know, if they want to make a difference, if you will. That's one of the things, yes.
Okay, great.
Okay.
You want to tell me something else before I ask you my next question?
No, you can. I was going to share some of our recommendations, but you can
Go ahead and
ask.
share those recommendations, because
Okay.
you know, we can talk about what I'm going to ask you on another
Okay.
visit.
Okay. So some of the recommendations that we have put forth then for the farmer: eliminate use of the term historically underserved producers, and I already talked about why there, and limit the use of the term socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. What we're saying is call the group what they are. So if there's something for black farmers, say black farmers.
Call it.
Exactly. If it's for indigenous or Native Americans, specify that. So there are already enough labels then without, you know, some of these terms that cause more confusion. We implement and fully fund the Justice for Black Farmers Act. Close the gap in funding disparities between 1890 and 1862 land grant universities. So let me just share real quickly. When the 1862 universities were established, they were given land grants. That's why they're called land grants. The 1890s are still waiting for their land grants. They never received it, okay? And I'll say that. So in addition to that, there are huge differences in the amount of funding that are provided to the 1862s versus the 1890s. And you know, another example, or one example, is the how they can use research dollars. So one is defined in the Hatch Act, the other is in the Evans Act, and it's very different. The 1862 universities have more flexibility in how they can use those research dollars. So it's like that's a simple enough fix from our perspective. Change the language to make it equitable. Now, so one controversial, you know, recommendation that we have is eliminate FSA state and county committees. And I say it's controversial because, but what we have found then, and if you look at number of studies, you know, dating back to the 1980s, when there was a finding of discrimination at USDA there. And the source of a lot of discrimination was the FSA state and county committees. So we say either fix them once and for all or eliminate them.
And probably most of those appointments don't look like us.
Correct. That's correct. Now, starting to change some, but it's a long way to go. Yes. All right.
And what kinds of things do they control, just as an aside?
So participation in FSA programs, farm programs. So, you know, what I will say there is my understanding, the good old boy network is alive and well in a lot of these smaller, counties, if you will. They decide then who gets the farm programs in that community. Then, right, and so I don't think I have to say anymore.
You
there.
don't.
Yes, Okay.
Your next recommendation.
Well, the other two I would just mention, and these were the priorities: expand agricultural youth program to engage more minority youth, and support urban and community agricultural food production there. So we have, those are our top recommendations, if you will, and we go into more detail, but at least your viewers will have a sense of where our focus and priorities are.
Great. Well, thank you for those, for sharing the information about the recommendations of the Policy Center. And for our listeners and viewers, if you can get behind one or more of those recommendations, share it with your congressional delegation. And they will listen to you because they're going to be coming back to you all next year asking you for your vote again. So use the power that you have. Now, can we talk for a minute about air property and how it impacts the Black community, and what, if anything, the Policy Center has done or is doing in that regard?
So heirs property is when landowners, if you will, die without a will, if you will, intestate there, and so the property passes to their heirs. And so those heirs then do not have clear title. So that's what is known as cloudy title there. And so there are challenges in participating in USDA programs with, unclear title is one of the things. So in addition to not being able to make some decisions there because of the heirs, they're also limited in some of the programs that they can participate in. So one of the things that we are doing at the Policy Center, we actually have a cooperative agreement with the Farm Service Agency, then to provide train the trainer workshops, if you will, for minority serving institutions, for their extension staff to be able to educate then farmers on heirs property, what it is. So 3 sections. One is an overview that defines exactly what we're talking about. The second is prevention. How do you prevent heirs property from occurring in the future? And the third is resolution. So heirs property exists, and to your point earlier, it disproportionately in the Black community and the Native American communities, but especially in the Black community. And so a lot of that is educating them so they understand what their options are. And again, so we are providing the tools, the workbooks, everything that they will need just to be able to deliver the training. Then it's a plug and play, if you will. So to make it easy and to ensure consistency and quality across the system.
Well, and it's such a distressing thing because great-granddaddy might have had 30 acres, 50 acres that he had worked hard and been able to acquire. But he doesn't really want to choose one child over another child to be owner of that property, to be in charge of that property. So now you may have 5 children who own the property after granddaddy died, and then they each have 10 kids, and then when one passes away, now, and the heir, it just keeps morphing and morphing in size. And as you and I know, it's hard to get an agreement between 3. Let alone when you're dealing with 25 or 30. And I've heard you tell a story about, I think maybe your property or someone you knew, where there are over 100 or 200 heirs involved.
Yes.
And eventually, that land is probably going to not get the taxes paid.
Yes.
And as you said, it limits what you can do with it.
It does. I mean, again, it's all the things that you mentioned, happen. But I'll tell you, one of the attorneys that specializes in heirs property, what she shared, she said one way that she gets a lot of her customers to do a will there when they don't say it, she said, okay, so your daughter-in-law or whatever, is gonna get your fur coat than that one that I mean, so a little tongue-in-cheek, but it's like, so if you don't decide, then someone else will decide for you, including the state. Yes.
And you may not want that person to decide. You didn't like them when they were married to you or whatever.
Yes. So if you don't want someone else to decide how your property is divided or what will happen, then you need to do a will, estate planning, to make sure.
Or to make sure that deed is written right.
Absolutely. And even though you may have 4 children, who knows their children better than those parents? And you know that they are not all equal, in terms of responsibility. One of the things my grandfather used to say, well, 2 things. One, he used to say he wouldn't do a will at first, my grandfather, and because he said if you do a will, you die. I wish he was here to say, okay, Granddad, what happened? You didn't do a will, but you still died. Number 1, yes.
We're going to have to cut it off right there. I hate it, but as I said, mine, you can come back again. You're in tune to Unmuted.